I think of this question: is figurative painting coming back?
Yeah, I think it's come back already.
Okay.
But maybe not exactly in the way you would like it to.
That's the issue I have.
Yes.
I sometimes feel that am I being too negative, I should be happy because there's figurative painting coming back. But then I look at examples. If you just search for figurative painting returning or something like that, and I got up some articles about that, and it was so great. This is coming back. It goes and comes and goes, but now it's back again. And then you see the examples of the work they're talking about, and you understand that when they say figurative, you have this idea of figurative. They go this far, and you are here. So what you think of as figurative is something completely different than what they're talking about, because that's the basic thing, that it's not just about the figurative form, but it's about the whole mentality, the whole storytelling, the whole, if there's archetypal images there, and all of these things. So not least how it's painted, because you always see these strong colors, disconnected figures, and all of this kind of artification tricks that they use to make it so-called more modern, more acceptable.
Yeah. I think a lot of making it look more modern and more acceptable. I think a lot of skilled and classically trained painters feel a pressure to do that just to be successful in the market, because they have the examples of like artists who are going for a lot of money and what their work looks like. But I think in general, just the fact that figurative work is back, and that you have work made by younger people that is going for a ton of money in the auction houses now, means that culture does not view figuration in general as a taboo, which it did in the past. So the situation is better than it was much better than it was in the 1950s, for example, because in like the 50s, nobody was doing it. It was not something you would see in universities. It was not something you would see in galleries, and it definitely, and in museums, you would only see it like historically, because once, the MoMA really kind of landed and was the powerful form supported by, the U.S. government, and that whole mission was being broadcast, overseas as well. It really kind of evaporated up, and I know from people who are, older than me, who are going to school, that it was just not an option. It was not an option if you were trying to paint as anything figurative, just in that generalization of a category, not with the specific of like having a classical angle with like a very beautiful story. It was not okay. You needed to be non-representational and gestural, and so I think we've come a long way from that point, and I think that people just need to be, now that we're kind of accepting of the presence of the figure again, and then there's a prevalence of it, it will be natural for society to start to see the patterns and compare and sort of figure out what they really enjoy. But right now there's actually a lot of hype around young figurative painters in the States. And, for example, I have an old friend from high school who is a couple years younger than me. He, was painting, but then he's decided to study art history, and now he does art appraising, and he often posts on his social media like the results and some commentary on like recent auction results. So it's wild, but yeah, a lot of there's figurative painting is being very highly valued, some of it,
Yeah, but it's always a question of what is it? I mean, I remember talking to this guy who was so happy that figurative painting was coming back, and the example he gave was this, what's this called again? The Leipziger school, Leipziger Schule.
Yeah. And
when you look at it, it's all flat, poster-like, no expressions, no connection between the figures, no. It's sort of like a figurative Rothko, so somehow. Yeah. So that the color is color, the figures don't have any contact with each other. It's just paint on canvas. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering. So then the question is then, okay, well, does that make it easier for, let's say, classical figurative painting to be more appreciated, or does it make it more difficult? And I'm not so sure if it makes it more easy, because I'm thinking about it. I mean, you alluded to the whole CIA, the Cultural Investment Agency, and pushing modernist painting through this, what was it called again, the abstract artist idiom of the free world. Mm-hmm. And such exhibitions being pushed around in Europe. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, and I don't know if they are doing stuff like that still, but it seems to me to be at a point where these so-called modern values are so accepted that people who are painting figuratively have internalized those values and paint accordingly, so that even though they are figurative, they are not classical. They are not storytellers. They don't have this pathos of a Caravaggio or of a Rembrandt.
Yeah, but I feel like it's not so. I like to use Odd's metaphor that he was using, that like with this idea of kitsch and art, and like art is this like sort of like clean petri dish, and then like kitsch is this sort of like living sort of fungus, and that like, some artists are kind of like a hybrid in some ways. So I think there are a lot of these artists, like you can't make it like a black and white thing, that some of them do contain elements of a narrative or pathos, or but also somehow have a bridge into some of the aspects of modernism. So they could be like a contemporary. They could look contemporary, but then have a narrative to them. One of my neighbors in my building, I mean, I think he kind of fits that description, and he also knows that he sort of satisfies some of the like the political agenda, as well as giving more exposure to demographics that were previously not represented in museums and galleries. So he satisfied that bill. But when I saw his work online, there was something I liked about it. It wasn't a very classical looking painting. It had some elements of like post-impressionism, but there definitely was a sense of like pathos, although it was on the side of like slightly cartoony, which I think we've talked about before, has an element of like, I'm serious, but I'm like, it's like softening the seriousness by like kind of hiding behind a cartooniness. I think there's a lot of work like that that's associated with the whole like pop surreal lowbrow movement. There is narrative and there is pathos. However, it's kind of like there's a veil behind this sort of like illustrative cartoonishness, and but that's what I mean. There's like these hybrids that they get sort of close, and I feel like it cracks the door open a little bit. But of course, before all of these movements happening now, because there's a lot of figurative movements happening now that weren't even like maybe 40 years ago. But people like Odd or David Laguerre were making these classical narrative paintings when almost nobody was doing it, and they were pioneers that sort of cracked the door open. And before them, after modern art really took charge, we were carried through that phase in the United States by the illustrators.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Odd Nerdrum talking a lot about that the illustration tradition in America sort of kept, well, not sort of, kept the classical tradition alive in the same way that classical composers came to America and became film composers. So film composing became a way to ensure that you still had tonal music, that they could survive in that context. And of course we also had, well, I'm just wondering about the importance of Andrew Wyeth, because he establishes himself like in 40s.
Yeah, he's such an interesting figure, because when the MoMA bought his work, there was like public outcry of people saying, this is not modern art, what is this doing here? And it's such a strange thing to go visit, because they like don't know where to put it in the museum. It's always like
they got the Christina's World, did they?
Yeah. This is always awkwardly in the hallway, or like by the bathroom, and there's always the biggest crowd is around that.
Yeah. Well, it's quite similar to Odd Nerdrum had this exhibition at the Astro-Friendly Museum of Modern Art in 1998, and I remember reading this article from 96, 94, where they bought because they have 4 works of him, I believe, and the director of them was saying that they had been thinking about it for a long time if they should do it or not, because they were concerned with if their reputation should fall from buying such work. And I think that's where I'm interested in this thing, where all of these things that we see coming as figurative painting generally doesn't have that Baroque drama of Odd Nerdrum, or that sentimentality, that sort of melancholy sentimentality of Andrew Wyeth. Because I think that is the major no in art. So you can be figured. I mean, it's John Currin, perfect example. Yeah. Lucien Freud, perfect example. And then you can say, okay, I saw this Lucien Freud's exhibition in 2005 in London, retrospective exhibition. And there were some things that were actually nicely painted, like some here and there. But of course, he's very careful to show his painting from photo, or thinking like a photo. And the lighting is equal all over, and it's the passive expressions, and you would never accuse him of being sentimental in a way.
Well, I think I just thought of something that it's interesting to look at those two things, and then at the threat of like artificial intelligence coming. And if you, well, I mean, they're already developing artificial intelligence to like learn the style and like look of certain painters to such a high level. A friend was telling me this in Barcelona, who knows one of the people developing this, and you can give an AI verbal commands to like say like, okay, I would like you to paint a scene containing this in the style of this person during this period and this AI can create it. So there needs to be a differentiation where the humanism is put to a test, and that's kind of you've read some Yuval Noah Harari, the guy who wrote *Sapiens*?
No, I know about it. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, he talks about that in some. He wrote *Sapiens*, and then he wrote *Homo Deus*, and then he wrote 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and he looks at he sees that some of the challenges for humanity, one of them is technological disruption, and seeing that a lot of industries and people are eventually going to be replaced by computers and things that can do the task. But and he thinks that now is the most important time that we use that to sort of increase our understanding of humanities. So if you look at it, if you were to kind of view painting and say, okay, well, all of these paintings are just very stylistic things, like people just developing these different styles and to satisfy the need to like have a brand and like stand out, and so they're marketable. They're really playing to that, but maybe they're not like pushing some like much higher thing, which would be like making a major contribution to our deepening our understanding of humanity in the same way that maybe like a Greek opera might. But so maybe as that sort of comes into play and we start to realize that our like real abilities and the place that we can contribute most is in that direction, maybe we'll change our focus to saying like, okay, we have this like figuration that contains, some humanity, and then we have this figuration that contains a lot more of the complexity of humanity that no AI machine can understand, that only like a real human can like make and understand.
Well, then you're talking about being really conscious about what the values are, what the values of classical painting are. That it's not just the figurative form. That it's not just composing some elements on the surface.
Right.
So it's, I think that's probably the most important thing, because you see so much of these artification tricks that they are doing to get accepted. You can just basically, all of these things in advance, where one thing is, of course, adding, so this exhibition, it had a lot of letters, like boxes with letters on, and drew it very carefully so that you get a lot of detail all over. And of course, demonstratively including modern objects, or you can have a landscape and then you suddenly put some black mass in front of it, so it punctures the credibility of it, and all of these things. So that's my main concern: is how strong is the allegiance to these modern values, or how much are they internalized? And I can find it myself too, that you think you've thought through your values, but then there still lingers something that are, because you just learned it from osmosis.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think this would be a good segue to talk about my experience in Iceland, just kind of like sharing work with people and just knowing that if there was anything that seemed to be classical or traditional, they almost perceived it to not be art, and that there was a kind of taboo around it. And
this was not so long ago, or?
Yeah. So you get a system, and it was entered into the education system in the United States. It was part of their plan. I think it was Michael Pierce did an essay on it where he was talking about this one radio broadcast that involved, I don't know, like the president and like the head of MoMA, and there was a whole, and the head of education, and there was a whole agenda to project these new modern values into all of the systems. And then, at that time, the Marshall Plan was sending money out to rebuild a lot of Europe and building roads and things in Iceland. And I think with that money came these ideas, and also they were sending the exhibition around. But going back to the education system, which is very straight, it was such a, people got behind it in a way, in the same way you would some kind of like fundamentalist idea. And some of the large schools, the prominent Ivy League schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, smashed their plaster cast collections, and they had some of the largest plaster cast collections in the States. And they were, they would have been very beautiful to see these things. I mean, if they were still in existence, I would go visit them. But it was sort of like to show the allegiance to the new art. And that, now we're turning our back from classical because the way forward that's the way forward, to, ignore these ideal forms and to look for new ones. But, I mean, that's impossible to do unless you're, it doesn't, it doesn't take into account for, the whole history of our human biological evolution, that there is a hierarchy of things, because we will not change the way our brain is structured in like a decade. Our brains are designed the way they are because we had to survive as a biological creature on this planet with things on this planet. So everything is geared towards that in the way we're designed. And you can't just change that overnight because your values change. Those are always going to be prominent. So, good luck, used car salesman selling like this, new flashy idea and expecting it to resonate forever. I mean, eventually the people who support it are going to disappear, and money is going to drift in other directions. And I think that's, maybe we're starting to see the evidence of that, because it's really not been that long that modernism's been around. And when I think of modernism, I don't think of like a contemporary idea. I think of an old historical idea now, an old historical idea that's gathering dust and doesn't, sure, these are interesting historical objects, but there's no way that they can continue to have as much relevance as they've had before. There's no way.
But then there's also the question of the people who are advocating classical ideas, not painters as such, but the people who are advocating it. And that's when you get into this whole idea of these conservative critics and their role. I'm thinking specifically about Roger Scruton, because I think he has done a lot of harm, because he stands there. I remember him at track in California.
Yep.
And I've seen him in such conferences before, where he says that basically that if you're not born with it, if you're not born a genius, you can just give up. And this is from the Alpine Fellowship. When was it? 2010 or something like that, or 12 maybe. You can just check it out. It's probably on Vimeo, I think.
Yeah.
And also what he does with the book Beauty, and with that documentary as well, where he talks about, and this is a fundamental thing. This goes to the core of the appeal of classical figurative painting, where it talks about it's Botticelli's Venus.
Yeah.
And says that it's the reason why it's so good is not because she's attractive as a woman, but it's the aesthetic perception of her. And I'm thinking that this is a fundamental problem here, that the strength of painting classical figuratively is that you're able to render this realistic form and make it sensually present.
Yeah.
So that's what you should emphasize, and not these ideas of which is the Kantian idea of aesthetical indifference.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the go-to position behind all of these artification tricks too. For example, using irony like John Currin, or this one kitsch critic was talking about how you can eradicate kitsch through laughter bombs. You make fun of it. It's like what Jeff Koons does when he makes this cute puppy, but it's how many feet tall?
Right.
So it becomes absurd, right?
Isn't that? I think they have a word for ironic kitsch, and I thought it was camp.
Yeah, camp.
Maybe
exactly.
I'm wrong. So,
exactly.
So they're just kind of like using a word that could be something more serious as in an ironic way.
But maybe think about that. Think about the illustration tradition, and I don't know if there's a difference there in America. Maybe there is. Think about the critiques I've read by, for example, Hilton Kramer or Richard Vine and other people. That was a fantastic thing. I did an article where I compared what has been said about Bork Nerdrum and what has been said about kitsch, and found it to be like a blueprint. And the funny thing was, in Norway, or in Europe, the phrasing was always negative. That is trying to be theatrical and trying to be eternal in its images as some kind of a negative thing. But then I think, I don't know if it was Hilton Kramer, who talks about these primordial images that have always existed, and it goes down to the depth of human existence, and said as a positive thing, and still confirming the whole idea that it's complying completely with the idea what has been written about Odd and what also has been written about Kitsch. So I don't know if there's a general more positive atmosphere among certain critics also in America than in Europe. I'm not sure, because here's another example. It's not about critics, but it's about what is being furthered.
Yeah.
So we both know this museum in Barcelona, and there was this exhibition with the Odd Nerdrum students there, and that's nice. But I remember coming in there, and they had a statement on the wall there, and emphasizing that this has to be modern, it has to be of the time, and then you go back to this whole idea. It's, okay, you're supporting something going in a classical direction, but then comes this thing in that stops it from being, because the classical tradition is not that it's just figurative. Yeah. The basis is the whole human drama, the whole pathos of it.
Right. I think they didn't name that place right. I don't think they should.
Museum. What is it? Museum of
Modern European Art Museum or something.
No, it's Museum Europeana Arte Moderne, something like that.
Okay.
So of European modern art.
It would be kind of more appropriate to say that it's like a contemporary classical art museum, because I don't know, maybe not classical, because everything's not classical, but like contemporary representational art museum. I mean, that's how I think of it. Like, there's nothing really about the museum that is modern, because modern would make most of the things they show a taboo.
No, but again, that's where I'm, in my mind, a lot of it wouldn't be. Because you have a lot of these things obviously painted from photo, or there's a sort of an incidental excerpt in a motif, where everything is equally valid, there's no focus in the painting, all these typical artification tricks that.
Yeah. So when you're describing, so I think the two types of figuration that exist in the world now, maybe there are some that comes from a more sort of like classical, historical, rich context, and then there's other stuff that sort of like evolves out of the petri dish of modernism. So it has some aspects that look a little bit like classical because it's figurative, but it's building up from it's taking some of the reductionism of modernism and adding some layers of complexity on top of that. And then, modernism was, taking the rib out of, classical and like creating a new thing. So it's just an extraction of different elements that were all complexly layered together and functioning as a whole, and then just taking one element and expanding on it. And I mean, the two can exist together, and maybe, for example, some people want to live with, a two-dimensional object that has less information because they're just exhausted by contemporary life, and they want to look at, basically a blank wall with like a little bit more than a blank wall, and I can understand that, and I think it's not necessary to have these models of reductionism to better understand classical painting, but maybe for the layperson, maybe it's helpful. Maybe it's helpful to like be able to try to understand a picture that is composed of lines and shapes, and then when they go to see a more like rich, full, classical narrative painting, they can kind of like see the pattern a little bit better. I don't know, because it's hard for me to imagine their mind, because I've always been very much into painting, and it's just part of my daily existence, and sometimes I forget that that's not the way for other people.
No, I think the way to go is, you're sort of describing that modernism or modern art can be is on such a lower level that you can sort of get into it and then rise up to classical painting.
Yeah.
But and that's a funny way to look at it. What I'm concerned with, though, is that when you go into when the standard is modernism or modern art, then people learn to not appreciate complex stories, dramatic stories. Because if you, just think about literature.
Yeah.
You read Roald Dahl's children's stories, The Chocolate Factory or whatever it is, as a young boy, and it just captures you. And you get that lust of, if you're a painter or let's say a writer, to try to make something like that. So I think perhaps people need to be trained in sentimentality.
Yeah.
That's the basis, because sentimentality is what you see in these movies when she is taking its war, they're separated, and he goes through hell and high water to get to her. Yes. And that's sentimentality, and it's allowed in film.
Yeah, yeah. It's humanism. We need more humanist philosophers to help people understand and value the qualities of being a human and the complexity and the experiences of being a human, and that very soon it's going to become very important to distinguish and develop, to hold on to humanity as it sort of like starts to fray away at the edges as we integrate into more powerful technology. That's going to be the thing that keeps us together.
Yeah, and then you have all this purely political aspects. Like one of these articles I read, they were talking about how after COVID, people need to see people again.
Yeah.
And that's why figurative painting is coming back. But again, the examples that they use are strong colors, completely indifferent paintings. And who did I talk with that about? It would be kind of eerie if you come into a room with a lot of people and they're just sitting there still, nobody's saying anything, they're just looking straight ahead, do not acknowledge you at all. And it stays like that for like 2 hours. That's freaky, right?
They're like, wow, COVID's affected a lot of people.
No, but then suddenly, when it comes to a painting, people behaving like that should suddenly be appealing to spend time with. If we're talking about the humanistic aspect here, you have to bring in the sentimentality. If not, there is no humanism. That's the whole basis. That's what makes us human beings, is the sentimentality, the connection, and the empathy with other people.
Well, yeah, I think these more modern-looking types of figuration are relying on people to project their own sentimentality into it when it's not present, and that unfortunately is an aspect of modernism that we have really come to expect with art. Modernism has expected us to approach an object and have the object like not really give us anything, and that we either need like to read the wall or to have like some art theory book in our pocket, that we're going to have to show up to this thing that is guiding us very little and like complete it with, some theory or something else that we're carrying with us. So I think that's one of the things that is shaping figuration, because they're like people who grow up with the dogma of modern art still lingering around, have this expectation that an experience of painting involves seeing something that doesn't tell them very much, and it's just a current state of things, and I don't think it necessarily will last through many more generations, especially as there is more and more work with content coming to the front and You know, there could be a shift coming.
Yeah. Well, I think also this is something that I've thought about since I had a conversation with Boris Kohler about the whole gallery system.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole gallery system comes more or less simultaneously with the onslaught of modernism or early modernism. I mean, you could say that Impressionism and these things are turning more modern, right?
Yeah.
So the whole, when you talk about the gallery system, you're talking about modern art.
Yeah.
So of course there are galleries that show classic figurative work, but as a general rule, that's the direction it goes in. So then you're talking about the one possibility would be, as my wet dream is, to have a cooperation with architects that work classically, because building classical buildings brings in all those other crafts.
Oh yeah,
Because,
that Adam Miller, I was visiting him, and he was looking for a place to exhibit some paintings, and I think he was talking to an art critic in the U.S., and that critic was mentioning, oh, maybe I can get you a show at this contemporary art museum, but I'm like, his paintings are not really meant for that kind of space. Like, I was like, look at all these like empty old buildings in Italy. Why don't you instead have a place here? Or like, better yet, why don't you just start like designing the space for them, and it can exist, digitally or something, like, but like, create the space for the work. Like, there definitely needs to be an interaction between the architecture and the work, because a lot of these older paintings that we love are paintings that were designed for these like dark churches lit by candles, and not for these like bleached white walls. They don't look right in there. There's a certain type of work that looks in a white cube, and it's a sterile environment. So you can't have too much going on in an image in a sterile environment, or it will just seem out of control. But if it's in a more rich, ornate environment, it seems perfectly at home. And yeah, so context is very important for things, and I think context is what really sets the value of things as well in the world today.
Yeah, and I'm thinking this is something that Boris Kohler talked about, how perhaps it's not, or perhaps it's even better that you get commissions like that, so that you have a specific task to test your talent on. So it's not this, because it's so easy to get caught in this cliche that I have to express myself. But with a task like that, that's not the point.
Right.
You focus then on the craft, you focus then on the story that has to be told, and that's it. And to make it as well as you can.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting thing with like having an architectural setting as part of the presentation of the work, is that you can create more of you're focused on more of like kind of a total experience. Not like an object plucked out of a total experience. Like, you can really set the stage and the mood and the sort of the attitude in which the person kind of approaches the work. And, the white wall gallery setting is just one type of situation, and it only offers one type of experience, and it would be it would be much more beautiful to have it in a space that guided you into the intended experience and mood and atmosphere of the painting. I mean, that could be really great. I mean, it's like almost at the level of like virtual reality, but without having to wear like some big clunky goggles on your face.
Yeah, and I think not waiting for this anointment from the critics. Of course, it's easy to say you should rather get a job, side job, to make money than to start compromising your work and become more modern, more accepted. Right?
Yeah.
That you because this is that's a fantastic scene from Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, where John Galt stands up. There's 6,000 workers there. They're all afraid to say what they really want, and he stands up and says it, and nobody touches him, because they're just in sort of some kind of awe that someone actually doesn't do what the others are doing. And to know that it's never a good deal to start to artify your work to be accepted, because then you're not doing anymore what you set out to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, living in New York, I definitely saw a lot of people doing that, because you're constantly reminded of what's being shown in the galleries, what's successful in the auctions, and it's often not this like more classical work. And I hate to say it, but I feel like the academic work does not help, because if the you know, the more narratively rich work is, if it, you know, a less educated eye associates it with this academic work that doesn't contain much narrative but has a lot of skill, and it gets, you know, I've kind of like, as a painter, I've had a lot of that, where you get associated with a group and you're like, I'm not so sure. But yeah, that's what happens. You like someone, you get lumped in. So I think figurative narrative work, when it is representational and has an element of realism, gets kind of stuck with things that could be, you know, photorealistic or very academic. And I feel like it kind of drags it down, unfortunately. And also because you know, the whole like art industry and the hobbyist industry. So I think with everyone like going out and buying, you know, landscape painting boxes and painting in the landscape, the genre of landscape painting is so very accessible to the layperson that it has sort of like diminished the integrity of landscape painting as a genre. Because if you're not a trained eye, which most people are not, you look at landscape painting and you're like, oh yeah, my grandmother does that, you know. So that's unfortunate.
But then you get back to that situation where what you can offer, which does stand out, is to create human drama.
Yeah.
It's like it's so often that what you should do seems to be counterintuitive. Not that you should do anything that is counterintuitive, but it's like, instead of pushing back, just go full scale into it.
Yeah, do the hard thing.
Yeah.
Take the difficult path.
Yeah, and I think actually, because that's something I try to be aware of, that it's easy to say, no, figurative painting is not coming back at all, and I've just decided that it shouldn't, or that it doesn't. But of course, there's a gallery here, suddenly there's a gallery there, suddenly there's some art historian writing about it who actually sees that there is something there. Yeah. So and obviously there must be a lot of people within these institutions that are frustrated because what they see as value is not being represented. So that's where you have to go full scale into it and try to be as dramatic and as kitsch as you can, because for some reason that makes an impression on people.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
Yeah, you have to kind of overcome the various handicaps thrown at you by just like going, you know, throwing the throttle forward, just going harder and bigger, and, you know, more content, but without trying to placate to the, you know, whatever is trending, or, you know, then you just kind of crumble into the masses. You're just sort of like washed in. You're just another drop in the sea.
Yeah, if if your work reflects your time, you will die along with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can look at the examples of like we were talking about with Apelles and the figures who didn't look around, around them, the people who were painting, but looked back to this text and these were motivated by these qualities, and just strove to be against, to make something that was not even existing around them. And that's when you can, people talking about whatever, new and original, but like, why don't you just like, there's no point of new and original. Unless you landed here from another planet, good luck on new and original. Like, you're a human being, your genetics are based on human experience. The only reason you'd pick up a paintbrush is because people have been painting for thousands of years. So what are you talking about, new and original? Like, give me a break.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the most stupid thing the reason why things really strike you is that it resonates so well with what you've experienced, but because you haven't realized perhaps that specific thing yet, then it becomes a so-called original experience to you.
Yeah.
But it's just because it reflects something that is internal in you that you were not aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Why not like change the project rather than like trying to make something that's new and original? Why not try to make something that is like incredibly unoriginal and resonates with like everything that is being a human, and that would be a better goal, because the other thing is just a lie. It's a vacuous lie.
Yeah, well, that's the irony of it, isn't it? Where, for example, if you take Lewis and Freud, all this depressed or indifferent people, which fits the whole idea that if you go into your inner self, what you see in the end is just hopelessness. And then they think that is the story about human nature. And they forget that sometimes you were happy, sometimes you were exalted, sometimes you're really angry. That's probably part of human nature as well.
Yeah. If you look at the oldest painting, the cave paintings, the way that they were made, it was an accumulative effort. They were, a single image was painted by many different hands over like 1,000 years or something, or hundreds of years. So it wasn't one person being like, "Papa, ta-da! Look at my buffalo I painted. Hello." It was like everyone came in, and it was kept alive. The tradition was kept alive. Someone would come in, the next person would come in and redraw the buffalo, and it was the accumulated effort of all of these minds and hands that created this image. And it's the same thing, even when you start to differentiate and recognize the individual artists. We're still doing the same thing, but we're not drawing the same buffalo. We're not on the same wall. We're on different canvases, but we're still adding to the same thing. It's a cumulative effort of humanity. And we're doing all different things, but we have to see it that we're all kind of trying to add to the picture. Because painting is really just, it's a way to visualize human consciousness, how we see the world, how we relate to the world around us, what is important, what is the hierarchy of our experience, what do we find important in the world. That is why there are more portraits and figurative painting than really anything, because if you just look at the brain and how the brain is designed by our biological experience. What is the most important thing? The most important thing is our relation to other humans, because that determines our survival. So, and what is the most represented thing? It's the human face. That takes up the biggest area of the cortex, because that is the most important thing. That has the most information that is pertinent to us for our survival. So just acknowledging that means that, conceptualizing that, looking at that, understanding that, deepening our understanding of that is just important to our survival. It always has been, and nothing changes. It always will be.
Yeah, tend to think of it like this. When you read about, we know there's rules in art, things that are allowed, that are not allowed. Dante says you can paint like Rembrandt, but you have to reflect our time because we live today. But what all this boils down to is that the most evil thing that they can imagine is a crying child. And you start thinking about that. If you really take them literally, they are on this moral high horse. Well, that high priest is saying that the crying child is the most evil thing you can be in contact with. That's basically what they're saying. When sentimentality is not allowed, something you should not be in contact with. This is like, wasn't that what Skinner was doing? This thing about not having physical contact with a baby. These experiments, right?
Yeah.
And I think some of them were perhaps in Germany in the 30s or so, where they experimented with see what happens to a human being that doesn't.
They're preparing us for
contact.
the Matrix.
Yeah.
They're like,
that's what modernism is about.
Maybe so.
We got it.
Yeah.
We are the resistance.
Right. Yeah. Humanism is the resistance. It is. I'm sure of it. Yeah, because otherwise we just lose ourselves as we are integrated into technology where, if we lose a sense of humanity, we lose a sense of ourselves, and all of a sudden we're just part of the machine, and maybe, I don't know, I'm going to go into a very deep or weird sci-fi direction, but I mean, what could happen is we have an artificial intelligence that starts to treat us in the same way that we treat animals, and it no longer needs us and just basically colonizes the universe. Hopefully that won't happen, but I've had bad dreams about it before. Sorry.
I don't know what to add to that. It's that's like trying to be elected president after Barack Obama. Well, Trump did, so. Oh my God, what does that say about me?